Welcome back to our study called Say You're My Sister. And we're looking at Genesis 12. Today we're in verse 10. And it's really the setting of the whole rest of this little story here. And so we'll see that there's a famine. Genesis 12:10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land." If you're familiar with the Old Testament, then you're familiar with the idea of famine. Famines could occur for many different reasons. Sometimes famine would come because of the lack of rain. There's no rain, then there's no crops, which is obviously a problem. And it's obviously a problem for societies based on farming. So an agrarian society needs rain. If there's no rain, there's a famine. The setting of the story of Elijah and his showdown with the prophets of Baal is famine caused by the lack of rain. Another reason famines occurred is because of raiding parties. You got bands of armed men would storm into a city, steal all the produce that the people had just harvested. They would check their calendars to see when harvest time was coming, and then they come in to steal everything. So then there was a famine in the land because all the stuff that they already had is gone. Just read the book of Judges, and you'll see the bands of raiders going across the land. Then there are famines caused by sieges. Foreign kings would lay siege to a town or area instead of directly attacking it. The people would flee to the town for protection, but their source of food was out in the fields, and they're cut off. And this is the only way that they would have food. So if they're only living on what they already had stored in the town before. So if you don't have any means of getting extra food, you let a certain amount of time go by, you lay siege to a city. Eventually the people start dying, or they give up because they don't want to put up with it anymore, and they pay a tribute, or you're able just to walk in and take the city. So sometimes the Bible mentions those. There's a number of those, especially in the era of the kings. You see that quite a few times with the famines happening in the land because the land's under siege. So we're not told in our text here what secondary cause brought about this famine, but we know that two things are for certain. The famine was severe, and God was the reason. Now this is the part of the story that we must remember here, we've come to. Even though we see Abraham as a hero of the faith, all the heroes were sinners. And like all sinners, their hearts were prone to wander. Remember that it hasn't been very long since God called Abram to leave behind his idol-worshiping family. Abram had a lifelong process of learning and sanctification ahead of him, just like us. Following God is a walk, but sometimes it's a crawl. It's a dirt under your fingernails, energy-depleting crawl. You're just trying to make it to the next spot. Sometimes that's how it is. And, sometimes we might be tempted to think, why in the world would he do that? Why in the world would Abram do that? Why would, any of these guys? Why did Noah do what he did? Well, the answer is, he's a sinner. I'm sure people look at us and say the same things. Why did he do that? That was ridiculous. That was stupid. Same answer. Sinner. That's it. Sinful nature. Right there. Why did Abram do what he's about to do in the story? He's a sinner. He has a sinful nature. He inherited it from his father, Adam, way back from the beginning. Though he has a sinful nature, Abram's also blessed. We've got to remember that. We need to stop and consider what we read in the first part of chapter 12. Abram has been blessed by God. Done. Settled. There are three main areas by which Abram was blessed by God. Remember this. The first was that he would become a great nation. Later on, God would tell him that his descendants will be as the dust of the earth. On another occasion, God tells him to try and count the stars, and then tells him that his descendants would be like the stars. In chapter 16, we saw the promise that his descendants would be too many to count. In chapter 17, the Lord tells Abram that he would multiply him greatly. Abram clearly has the promise from God that he would have countless descendants. It's repeated over and over again. Now the second blessing concerns the land. God promised to Abram, "To your offspring I will give this land." Now this promise repeats in chapter 13 and again in chapter 17, where we read, "All the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession." That's what was given to his offspring. An everlasting possession. So that's the second promise. Now the third promise is the blessing of the nations. Abraham would be a source of blessing for all the families of the earth. Again, we see this idea before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as God allows Abram to intercede for Sodom, which is amazing to think, but he does. God says that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. And again, we see the promise of the blessing of nations after the sacrifice of Isaac. In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So where do you think Satan will attack Abram, and God will need to grow and try his faith? What areas do you think he's going to go after? Exactly, in these 3 areas. And we'll see that next time as we look at God and Abram's fear.